Section 3 of day 4's lecture, let's talk a little bit about how money impacts interest rates, right? Particularly what happens when the Federal Reserve changes monetary policy. How does that impact interest rates? We've talked about how expected inflation impacts interest rates, how business cycles impact interest rates, how expectations of the future impact interest rates. How about monetary policy? Because that's obviously a crucial factor in determining interest rates. We're going to have a lot more to say about this later in the class. So, we're not going to go into any great detail talking about this now, but we do have to kind of at least introduce the basics of how monetary policy impacts interest rates. If you remember from Principles of Macro, the primary way that the Federal Reserve influences interest rates is through open market operations, right? The Fed buying and selling treasury bills, right? So when the Fed buys or sells treasury bills, that changes the money supply. If the Fed buys a treasury bill, they take the treasury bill, and how do they pay for it? By printing up money, right? By printing up money. So the Fed creates new money when they conduct an open market purchase. And when the Fed conducts an open market sale, they're taking money out of the financial system. At the same time that they're changing the money supply, though, the Fed is also changing the demand for bonds. And by changing the demand for bonds, they're changing interest rates. So if we look at our notes here, think about what happens when the Fed conducts an open market purchase. They buy treasury bills. When they do this, they're essentially creating new reserves in the banking system. As I said, they take the bond and they create new reserves, new money for banks. This also creates an increase in bond demand. This increase in bond demand drives up bond prices and drives down interest rates. This is what we call the liquidity effect, right? That when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates go down. And of course, this works in reverse too. If the Fed conducts an open market sale, they are taking M1 out of the financial system, reducing bond demand and increasing interest rates. So this is the primary effect that the Fed has on interest rates. But we also have to be aware of, and this is where the story gets more complicated, is that there's more to the story. Because what happens if the Fed would continue to increase the money supply over and over again and try to drive down interest rates over and over again? Well, the worry is eventually that could lead to higher inflation. That could increase interest rates. It could also drive up output that increases interest rates. So now our story is complex because there's a reason to think that when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates go down. But now there's also a reason to think that when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates go up. Which is it? Which of these three effects, the liquidity effect, the expected inflation effect, or the income effect? Which of these determines how monetary policy impacts interest rates? So in figure 11 here of your book, they have kind of three alternatives. Let me expand this a little bit. Three alternatives to think about how an increase in the money supply might impact interest rates. Let's look at these alternatives. The first alternative would be that the liquidity effect is bigger than the income and expected inflation effect, both in the short run and the long run. So in other words, when the Fed increases the money supply at this point, notice that the interest rates go down and they never come up to where they were before, right? So the liquidity effect drives interest rates down. The income and the expected inflation effect drive interest rates up, but they're not as big enough to offset the liquidity effect. So when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates always stay lower. Another alternative would be this one, that when the Fed increases the money supply, the liquidity effect dominates initially, but then over the long run, the income and expected inflation effect begin to dominate, right? So there's a difference between the short run impact and the long run impact. The third scenario is the liquidity effect is never very big, and it's only the income and expected inflation effects that dominate. So which of these three scenarios is most, or best describes the way that the world works? And I will tell you that markets believe, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that markets are correct in this belief, that it's this second alternative that really describes how monetary policy impacts interest rates. That in the short run, when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates go down. But if the Fed does that too much, when the Fed starts to increase money supply, it will drive up interest rates. So in other words, there's this distinction between the short run effect of an increase in the money supply and the long run effect of an increase in the money supply. So this is complicated, because what this means is you can't tell anything about monetary policy based on the level of interest rates. Interest rates could be low because the Fed has kept money supply going up through the liquidity effect, but interest rates could also be kept low because the Fed's kept money supply down and they've kept expected inflation down. Interest rates could be high because the Fed's cut the money supply and driven up interest rates through the liquidity effect, or interest rates could be high because the Fed's been printing up too much money and that's kept expected inflation high. So in other words, I can't, if you tell me that interest rates are 8%, that tells me nothing about monetary policy, right? I don't know if interest rates are at 8% because the Fed or because the central bank has been cutting the money supply, or if because they've been increasing the money supply. Why? Because the short run impact of policy is different than the long run impact of policy. So to understand this, you really have to understand the context, the history, right? And to understand how markets interpret changes in money supply to kind of be able to think about the role that monetary policy plays in interest rates. It's complex, right? It's complex. Interest rates can be high because monetary policy has been tight, or interest rates can be high because monetary policy has been loose. And you don't know that unless you know a little bit more about the context and the history of things. And so, I think this is thinking about interest rates at a deeper level, right? You have to kind of understand monetary policy to be able to understand interest rates and how it can have these conflicting effects, right? And distinguishing between the liquidity effect in the short run and then the long run impact on expected inflation and output is, I think, really one of the keys to being a more smarter and more accurate observer of what happens to interest rates and bond markets. If you look here at the data on money growth and interest rates, you'll see here that there's a lot of volatility in money growth rates, right? And it's really, in many ways, very difficult to see what this relationship is between money growth and interest rates. And once again, the relationship is hard to see because there's such a distinction between the long run effect and the short run. So in general, if you could kind of take out all the little blips and just kind of look at trends, you'll see that yes, when money growth is higher, interest rates tend to go up. And when money growth is lower, interest rates tend to go down. But if you just kind of look at more short-term periods, like year to year, you'll see more that when the money supply goes up, interest rates go down, right? So in other words, over the long term, it's the expected inflation effect that dominates. In the short term, it's more the liquidity effect. And I realize that's kind of hard to see in this graph because there's so many different things going on, but you have to understand that distinction, okay? So I can't emphasize this enough, right? Cannot emphasize this point enough. You can't just look at the level of interest rates and say interest rates have gone up, so the Fed must have been cutting the money supply. No, right? We don't know. There's other things that could be impacting interest rates. And there's this distinction between the short run impact of a Fed policy and the long run impact of a Fed policy, right? So you really have to understand that crucial distinction. So we've talked a lot here in chapter 5 of Michigan about the things that impact interest rates. And let me just kind of very briefly sum up some of these big things. The crucial things to understand are expected inflation, right? And the Fisher effect, how higher expected inflation drives up interest rates. We have to understand how changes in economic conditions, like the business cycle, impact interest rates. In general, during good times, interest rates go up, and during bad times, interest rates go down. We have to understand how risk impacts interest rates, right? We've talked about that in great detail. We have to understand monetary policy and how monetary policy impacts interest rates. So those are the four big things. We've talked about some other things in this chapter, but those are the four big things that we really, really have to have a good conception of if we understand why interest rates go up and interest rates go down. So that really finishes chapter 5 on interest rates. Next, we're going to move to chapter 6, which is a shorter chapter talking more about why individual bonds have interest rates that differ from other bonds, right? So I'll see you in a moment.